I just got done putting 700 yards of line on this 14 weight Redington Grande for pelagics. I'm gonna show you how I set up a reel for big game fishing. There are some really important things to keep in mind spooling up a fly reel for big game fishing in particular. I'm talking about stuff like GT, tuna, marlin, tarpon. Really big fish require some specific things when it comes to spooling a reel you're gonna need to know. Now, I'm hanging out at Uni-Knot Outfitters. If you need a reel spooled up, first thing I wanna say is go to your fly shop, get them to do it. So I'm spooling up a Redington Grande in the 14 plus size. Now, this is a giant reel, holds a ton of line, and has a lot of drag. When you're setting up a reel for really large, hard fighting species, using a lot of drag, using heavy lines and long distances of lines, there are some specific things you need to keep in mind. Things matter a lot more on this larger scale in terms of knot strength, durability, your line binding up on something like a 16 weight versus something like a trout rod or a bass rod or something like that. So I'm gonna go through and spool up this Redington Grande. I'll show you what I do kind of step by step of the process. This setup is gonna be about the same for any of my hard fighting saltwater species. So stuff like tarpon, maybe rooster fish, permit, all those larger size fish that are really gonna test the drag and really take out a lot of line, I'm gonna set up very similar to this. So running through the pieces I've got here, this is the Redington Grande in a 14 plus. I've got some Cortland braided backing. So this is their C16 super braid. It's a 16 carrier braid. The thing I like about the C16 is it is a spliceable braid, meaning that it's got a hollow core, so you can actually splice your fly line directly into this. Alternatively, you can use a Bimini Twist. I'll show you a little bit more about that when we get to that point. Of course, I've got my fly line itself. I'm using an 80-pound braided backing, and then this is a Scientific Angler's Big Water taper. This is no longer made, I don't think. This has got a 100-pound monofilament core. So you wanna make sure that the weakest point of your system is going to be your tippet. Now, if you're fishing IGFA, of course you can't go past 20 pounds anyway. I don't really care about IGFA, sorry. I'm running 40-pound tippet for pretty much all of my large saltwater species anyway, including tarpon. Call me a heathen if you want to, but I think it's a little bit more ethical. It lets me land fish faster, especially with the way that sharks are so aggressive these days, and you just don't wanna overplay those fish. I'm fishing 40-pound tippet. Fishing something like 50-pound or 40-pound tippet is going to oftentimes make your fly line your weakest link unless you're fishing a fly line that has a significantly stronger core like this SA Big Water taper. So between this 100-pound core and an 80-pound braided backing, it's gonna ensure that my tippet and my leader is gonna be breaking first. Granted, there can always be a weak spot in your line, but I want to make my weakest link something that's cheap and easier to lose. So instead of breaking off a $100 fly line or $100 fly line and $50 in backing, I want to break that tippet off. And then last thing here is just some glue. This is some Z-Mitt. You can use any kind of glue. Something flexible helps, but it doesn't have to be flexible. All right, let's get into it. Let me pop my spool off here. So I'm just gonna put this thing in my reel winder here as tightly as I can. Do not try this at home. You have to put a lot of tension on this line, and that's really only possible with a line winder. Go to a fly shop, throw a couple bucks their way or whatever, get them to wind it on because you're gonna need it tight. I'm also gonna go ahead and reset my line counter here, and we'll throw this spool of braid here. Good foundation for this reel. I like to do at least 2 turns. And arbor knots are fine for stuff like trout. I mean, odds that you ever see your arbor are extremely small anyway. Even if you do somehow see your arbor knot with a trout, your tippet's gonna be so light that's gonna break way before your arbor knot does. But with bigger setups where there is more of a possibility of fighting down to your arbor, I want a really strong system here. Push comes to shove, I'm at my arbor, I'm fighting that fish, I've still got a fighting chance. That's when you're gonna be applying maximum pressure to that fish. And sometimes that extra couple pounds of pressure fighting, right till the last minute is gonna be what it takes to get that fish to turn. So I did 2 wraps around my spool. I wanna make sure those wraps aren't crossed up as well if I can. And then I've got that Uni-Knot there. I'm gonna go ahead and trim my tag end here. And I just wanna make sure that's on really, really tight. 2 turns, it's just gonna spread out the load a little bit, then using that Uni-Knot as well. So let's go ahead and start winding this reel. If you've ever fished with a bait caster, you know about backlash. That's when that spool gets kind of detensioned, all that line gets really loose, and the problem with that is when that taut line you're actually fishing with gets pulled on, it can actually dig that line into that loose line on your spool. When that happens, if you were to hook a really big fish, it's gonna break off because it's gonna be a tangled mess. When you're fighting with a really, really heavy drag, that same thing can happen with your fly reel where your backing is too loose and that main line's gonna dig down into your backing and then eventually cause you to break off. To mitigate that, we've got to put our backing on really, really tight. We also have to do what's called a cross wrap. So every few wraps, what I'm gonna do is actually take my backing and cross the entire spool back and forth. I don't wanna lay all my wraps parallel because it's easy to cut through that if I'm fighting with a heavy drag. By putting those cross wraps is gonna prevent that line from digging down into the spool. To keep it from digging in, you've gotta put your backing on extremely tight, like to the point where I've seen this break cheap reels. Now again, this spool tension is not necessary if you're not fighting really big fish. On something like even a striper rod, I'll put that backing on tight, but I'm not going to really crank it on there. But with something for pelagics or tarpon like this, I'm gonna put it on very, very tight because I don't want that digging in and costing me a fish. So for this, I'm applying a lot of pressure with this left hand on my line here, and that's gonna make sure I've got plenty of tension on my reel and on that backing as I'm putting it on. You really gotta get this stuff locked in there. Like I said, I'm also making those cross wraps closer down to the arbor. It's not quite as important because you're never gonna be digging way down in there. And there's just less mass down there that can't be compressed as easy. But you still wanna do those tight wraps and you still wanna be doing those cross wraps as you go. Another thing I wanna do is make sure I'm not piling up too much line on either side. I want it very level. If you pile up a lot of line on one side and it falls down, that's gonna create that same effect with that line binding up and costing you a fish. So as you can see, as this line comes on the reel, I don't want it all parallel. I'm going kind of back and forth with these wraps, and that's gonna keep that line from having the opportunity to dig in. All right, so we are 252 yards in. I can't emphasize it enough, with big game reels like this, it's all about tension and cross wraps. You want to have that line on there tight, or else you are going to have it dig in and you're gonna break off fish. Ah! Because my fly line is a sinking fly line, it's gonna be significantly smaller diameter, so I can really afford to fill my arbor pretty far up. I'm hoping to get 500 or 600 yards on here, but we might end up with more than that, honestly. So this video is pretty much just gonna be a compilation of me burning the crap out of my hands, apparently. All right, so we're at 400 yards right now. I'm thinking we're gonna fit at least 200 yards more. So yeah, that's a lot of money in backing. So again, these are those cross wraps I'm making. So I'm gonna go all the way across as I'm going, and that's gonna prevent line from digging in. All right, so we are now at 500 yards on here. That is 600 yards. I'm gonna put a couple more on there and then we'll put our fly line on. 657, that's the magic number. So now let's get our fly line put on here. This connection from your backing into your fly line is super important because aside from your tippet, this is where you're most likely gonna have a break occur at unless somehow you get all the way down to your arbor. Now there's really two good ways to make this connection when you're talking about really big, really heavy line and hard fighting fish. And one is a Bimini Twist, the second is a splice. Both a Bimini Twist and a splice have some pros, they have some cons. Because I'm using a hollow core braid, I can splice this line and I'm going to splice this line. On my tarpon outfit, I use a Bimini Twist. I'm not gonna show you how to tie a Bimini Twist, but I'll go over when to use one and why I use one. Now, what's better about a splice? Number one, a splice is gonna be pretty much as strong as possible. You shouldn't lose any of the break strength of your line doing a splice. The other thing about a splice is it's a very clean connection. Even on a very well-tied Bimini Twist or a similar knot, you're going to have a little bit of a bump or a knot that's going to have some difficulty traveling through your guides. Now, if you're fighting a bass or even a striper, that knot traveling through your guides is not gonna matter too much. One, because your line is relatively thin diameter, but two, because it's not gonna be traveling that fast. But for something like tarpon, tuna, sailfish, marlin, that knot is coming out very fast. And because you have heavier backing, it's a bigger knot. That knot has possibility to catch your guides on the way out. If it does, one of three things is gonna happen. One, you're gonna break off that fish. Two, you're gonna break off guides, or three, it's gonna pull your rod apart or break your rod. So the splice is the best option if you have a line you can splice. Only a hollow core line like this Cortland C16 or another similar hollow core spliceable line, you're gonna be able to do a splice with. Most backing, even your gel spun, that kind of stuff, it's not gonna be possible to do a splice. Other reason not to do a splice is if you ever need to change your fly line. So on my tarpon reel, I go between a Scientific Angler's tarpon line in a floating and a tarpon line in a intermediate. And because I need to switch between those two lines, I've got a Bimini Twist with a loop-to-loop connection, so that all that I've gotta do is pull my line off, undo that loop-to-loop connection, and I can switch lines quickly. On this outfit, I'm not gonna need to switch lines, so I'm doing a splice for that reason and all the reasons I highlighted just a minute ago. So this is my tarpon reel. This is a Lamson Cobalt. They don't make this reel anymore. So this is my Bimini Twist. I've got it coated with a Uni-Knot glue. This is actually a doubled Bimini, so that's gonna give me 4 lines here, which is going to help spread the weight of this line a little bit more onto my loop-to-loop connection. This is a doubled loop-to-loop connection. With a single Bimini, to a single loop-to-loop connection, you've just got that one point of contact, so you can't have that line actually bite into it, especially with these really heavy drags and these thin diameter backings like this gel spun here. You can have that tendency to cut in, so by doubling it and doubling my loop-to-loop, it's gonna give me a much stronger connection. So anyway, that's how I do it when I'm doing a Bimini. So let's do this splice here. So for the splice I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take off some extra line here. A splice is both like the easiest knot ever and the hardest knot ever. So what I've done here to kind of prepare for the splice is I went ahead and took this line and I just rounded out the end of it. That's gonna make it easier to run through my line. It's also gonna make sure there's no friction points between the end of this fly line and the inside of this braid. So I'm just running this fly line down inside of this hollow core braid. This braid is gonna act like one of those Chinese finger traps you had as a kid, and it's going to cinch down when there's any kind of tension pulling this line out or pulling this line away. So I'm just kind of milking it on there. And I'm gonna do a couple feet this way. All right, I think I've got it through there all the way now. Make sure that it's laying on there the way that I want it to. Of course, I've got what? About 2 feet there. You wanna make sure it's tight on there because that's what's gonna give it that power to dig in. So I've got a couple feet of that splice put on now. So it starts here, and then I'm ending right there. So what is that, like 2-ish feet or so? I'm just gonna give that a nice pull. I've already kind of milked it on there real tight, making sure that it's on there well. The nice thing about this splice is, as you can see, it's super streamlined. It's also going to apply any pressure along the entire length of that splice. And the last thing I'm gonna do is just hit it in a couple spots with some glue, just to keep it from unraveling is the main thing. So I'm just using some Z-Mint here. I'm just gonna apply some glue, primarily looking at down here where it connects for the first time. And I don't wanna put a lot of glue on because even though this is a flexible glue, I still don't want to mess with the flexibility of this line too much. So I've got a dab of glue here, right where that fly line ends. I'm just gonna put a couple more little spots of glue kind of as I go down here. This is probably overkill, this is just what I do. And the main place that I want glue is down here at this far side where the end of that braid kind of starts to fray just a little bit where that fly line first goes into the braid. All right, cool. Let's give this some time to dry. So when you're fighting with a tight drag against species that are running really, really fast, this splice is the way to go. If you are using a Bimini Twist connection, what I do personally when I'm fighting something like a tarpon, you're not gonna be fighting with a really high rod angle anyway, but when I know I'm getting close to that backing connection, I'll straighten my rod out slightly. That's gonna let that knot travel through the guides a little bit more smoothly rather than having that rod big and arched up. That's something you gotta keep in mind, and the faster that fish is moving, the quicker and the more on your feet you've gotta be about doing that, which is why for pelagics, I wanna use this splice connection. So this last part here is really the least critical part of the whole system, and that's just spooling my fly line onto my reel. You'd spool this like any typical fly line, and you really don't have to do it under a ton of tension either, because their fly line's not gonna bite into your backing or really even bite into itself. You just wanna make sure you're laying it on there straight. You're not getting any bunches that are gonna fall over onto the rest of the line. Pretty straightforward. And then of course comes your leader, which you're just gonna build out for your particular quarry. She is all spooled up. One thing I did want to mention too is I want to leave some room between my fly line and my spool frame. And that's because when you're fighting a fish with a lot of backing out, it's very unlikely you're going to ever get it wrapped as tightly as you do in a controlled environment like here in the shop. Because you're not going to have it wound as tightly, it's going to be a little bit bulkier. So if you don't have some additional room up here, you're going to find that when you're bringing all that line back in, it's going to start binding because your spool is too full. So I want to leave some additional clearance for when that line is on there loose or when I'm actually fighting a fish. Get this thing cranked down here. All right, there she is. As you can see, we've got plenty of room up here. Honestly, probably could have got a little bit more backing on. If I'm out 700 yards on a fish, I'm probably gonna lose that fish, or at least I'm probably not gonna wanna reel all that back in, so that's plenty for me. So we are finally done with that. That took me like an hour or so. So it's not a quick process. If you've got any questions or any comments, whatever, let me know. And thanks for watching.